Hello, everyone, and once again, welcome to one of my craziest alternate scenario projects to date, as redundant as that statement may sound by now. This time, we're going to experiment with a type of alternate story that I personally like a lot, which is to teleport a specific geographic area and its inhabitants to a time other than the one they come from. And in this case, it would be a large Roman city, which, along with all its inhabitants, infrastructure, technologies, knowledge, and so on, would be teleported back in time during the Bronze Age collapse around the year 1150 BCE. While at first glance it may seem that a simple Roman city, even a Roman city during the height of the Roman Empire, could not contribute to a significant long-term change in a world relatively similar to the one they knew, in the sense that the Romans would not yet have things like bombs, firearms, cannons, engines, and so on to make a clear difference. Believe me, by the end of this video and its second part, you will realize that in reality, even an ancient civilization coming from the heights of antiquity can already have a huge influence with the changes it could bring to a decadent and dying civilization like the Bronze Age civilizations were in the year 1150 BCE. And no, you heard me right. This video is only the first part of a duology dealing with that topic. I'm pleased to announce that this story is actually not just my own work, but a collaboration with another content creator. And that person is none other than RealHistory, or Philoso Shy. This content creator is a very diverse one, with several channels to his credit discussing different and varied topics, but the channel that interests us, RealHistory, is the one where he manages the creation of alternate stories or scenarios like me. His best-known works being his series about what if the Romans fled to the Americas after the fall of Constantinople, granted, mostly thanks to me. Mostly good at analyzing logistics, numbers, data, daily anecdotes, and many Easter eggs, he will help me describe in detail and with more depth the changes that will occur in this new small Roman society, from the moment they would appear in the past to dominating all those who they would meet in their path with their superior technology and advances. And now, once the introductions are done, and knowing that the videos are probably going to be very long to edit, let's start with this crazy alternate story about if the Romans came back in time during the Bronze Age collapse.
Welcome, attractive and well-educated watchers. Like Emperor Carlos said, we're Philosophy from the channel Unreal History, and today we're glad to have the pleasure of participating in this collaboration with Emperor Carlos in chucking Trajan's Romans back in time to one of the most defining moments in our history, the Bronze Age collapse. Starting with the details, we're talking about the city of Augustodunum, modern-day Autun in France, from the year 117 CE. This was a major hub of Roman Gaul, with a population of around 30,000 people that included veterans, traders, craftsmen, teachers, slaves, and of course, soldiers. Augustodunum was not just a random provincial town, but rather a center of learning and metallurgy, filled with schools of rhetoric, philosophy, literacy, and even gladiator schools. Over 100 different schools operated there in total, making it one of the most highly educated cities in all of Gaul by size and population, with the literacy rate being extremely high compared to the rest of the empire. In some modern academic settings, this place is called the University Town of Gaul. On the infrastructure side, the Romans aren't just teleporting in with nothing. They've got aqueducts, sewer systems, public baths, latrines, water taps, because yes, Romans had water taps, as well as theaters, temples, and gymnasiums. In fact, Augustodunum had the largest theater in Gaul at the time. Just imagine being a Bronze Age villager living in a wooden hill fort, and suddenly you walk into a city with running water and massive paved streets. It would look like something from the gods. And of course, we can't forget the military. At this time, Augustodunum likely housed at least a cohort or two of Roman legionaries, plus local auxiliaries and veterans. That means around 800 to 1,000 trained soldiers at minimum, but many estimates, including our own, would put the total military presence of the city closer to 10,000 people once you include veterans, auxiliaries, engineers, and all the logistics staff that followed the army. Remember, a Roman legion was never just fighters. For every soldier, there were engineers, wagon drivers, smiths, cooks, and herds of livestock moving with them. The logistics train was enormous and crucial to Roman success. So, right from the moment of arrival, we have a population of 30,000 civilians with technology centuries ahead of the world around them, a working infrastructure, an educated elite, and a disciplined military core on this side. That is the starting package that gets dropped into the chaos of the year 1150 BCE. Now, let's take a step back and really look at what these Romans would be working with. The Augustodunum Romans aren't just plopped down in the Bronze Age with their own tools and houses, but rather they bring along a fully urbanized city, and that changes everything. First and foremost, agriculture. Romans in 117 CE had access to advanced farming tools like iron plows, crop rotation methods, irrigation ditches, and storage granaries. Their domesticated animals, especially oxen, pigs, and horses, were much larger and more productive than anything the locals had. Just to give an example, the Urnfield cattle of 1150 BCE barely reached a meter at the shoulder, while the Roman Chianina oxen could reach almost 2 meters. That's double the size, double the power, and double the efficiency in pulling plows. The productivity of their agriculture would skyrocket compared to anything in Europe at the time. Now, combine that with the environment. 1150 BCE Gaul, and really most of Europe, and even parts of North Africa, was far greener and wetter and more fertile than the Roman world of the 2nd century CE. Forests stretched for hundreds of miles, rivers were cleaner and fuller, and the soil hadn't yet been overfarmed by centuries of intensive agriculture. The Romans are stepping into a world of immensely rich and untapped resources, and they knew exactly how to exploit them. And that brings us to minerals. Gaul, in the late Bronze Age, is practically sitting on mountains of wealth. Lead, iron, coal, silver, even tin, all lying in massive deposits that are just kind of chilling around near the surface, many of which the Romans of 117 CE already knew how to access. But here's the kicker. In 1150 BCE, none of it had been touched on a large scale, and the Romans could set up mines, smelters, and forges immediately, with their techniques like water-powered trip hammers, because yes, those already existed in the 1st century. They could industrialize metal production in ways the locals could barely comprehend. And we're not just talking about swords and armor. We're talking lead for plumbing, iron for tools and construction, coal for fueling massive furnaces. They could create a homegrown steel economy in central Gaul centuries, if not a full millennium ahead of schedule. Infrastructure is another Roman advantage. These people can build roads, aqueducts, and fortifications faster than any Bronze Age culture could even imagine. Within a decade, they could connect Augustodunum to every major river and settlement in Gaul with paved roads, but way easier than you'd likely think. Within 20 years, they could have entire regions urbanized with new colonies, theaters, temples, and bathhouses. And remember, to the locals, this isn't just progress. This would be something along the lines of pure sorcery. Imagine living in a timber hill fort, and then suddenly, Romans show up with stone walls, running water, sewers, and public baths. Imagine seeing water taps in the street, or water mills crushing grain while you still use hand mills. These aren't just technological differences, they're civilization revolutions. So when you combine Roman know-how with the untouched natural resources of 1150 BCE Europe, you don't just get a city trying to survive. You actually get the seed of an empire that could grow faster, stronger, and more self-sufficient than even the Roman Empire in our timeline. By a lot. And after all that introduction, we hand over the reins back to Emperor Kaulos once again.
Thank you, Philosophai. Now, let's continue recounting the initial events of that teleportation of the city of Augustodunum to the past. Firstly, I would like to clarify that, like almost all ancient borders, the exact boundaries and contours of the city of Augustodunum are not known to modern historians because it is simply impossible to know that. Of course, it is easy to deduce that the edges of the city were much smaller than its modern counterpart, but again, since we have no idea of the actual size of the city at the time of Trajan's reign, for the teleportation of Augustodunum to the late Bronze Age era, we are going to select the outlines and edges of its modern equivalent, Autumn, with that entire piece of territory being selected to magically find itself teleported back to the year 1150 BCE. And with that, the Romans will certainly have a larger and more developed infrastructural base, not to mention a population perhaps slightly larger than we had estimated, thanks to all the people who would have lived on the outskirts of the city in its ancient iteration. Certainly, the teleportation would have been a very confusing and terrifying shock for the Romans, who would have experienced it as some kind of earthquake mixed with an eclipse that would have terrified the most superstitious and religious members of the city. As such, most of the city's infrastructure and inhabitants would have been unaffected by that event, with only some basic repairs being necessary, such as perhaps fixing or rebuilding a portion of the city's aqueduct, in case it had been cut off in parts due to a part of it being left behind in the future. But without a doubt, what would most occupy the attention of the inhabitants of Augustodunum would not be the small repairs that some infrastructure would require after that mysterious earthquake they experienced, but the totally different and changed view they had of the horizon beyond the city and its surrounding fields. I want to remind you again how vastly different a site like this would have been for the Romans. Gaul itself was already a very green and forested territory by the 2nd century CE, but by 1150 BCE, well, let's just say that the vast Germanic forests that terrified so much the Romans would have seemed tiny to them compared to the vast vegetation they would see in the distance. The city's elites and leaders would have been deeply confused and terrified by the situation, just like the rest of the inhabitants and slaves. This would be a unique situation, and they would have no idea what had happened. A quick excursion to the outskirts of the city and its surrounding countryside would have confirmed what everyone could already see in the distance. Those lands were not at all the same lands they had been in before the earthquake. For the Romans, it would be like landing in a completely alien world to the one they once knew, and they would be unable to identify it as Gaul, at least not the Gaul they knew. They would quickly realize that no contact from the outside was reaching the city, no merchants, no Roman patrols, no mailmen, nothing, absolutely nothing, not to mention that all the gigantic and long Roman roads that they had spent centuries building would have completely disappeared as well. The intellectuals, philosophers, and religious figures of the city would have understood that their territory had been teleported to another place, another world perhaps the world of the gods, and that expecting any external help from other cities, provinces, or from the emperor himself would be completely foolish on their part if they wanted to survive in these mysterious and unknown lands. But couldn't the hypothesis of simple time travel be put on the table? Well, not really. The concept and understanding of time travel, the hypothetical idea of returning to a time before your own, is something very recent in our history and literature. The Romans would not have instinctively had the idea to conceive such a crazy hypothesis. As many of you may know, the Romans viewed time and history itself as cyclical, that is, a perpetual beginning and end of the same story. Conceiving time horizontally from left to right as we imagine it today was not common at that time. Of course, I don't doubt that eventually some intellectual in the city will realize that they traveled back in time in the sense that we understand it today, but that wouldn't happen until several years into that era, and having further explored the few civilizations that resided around the Mediterranean, or at least what remained of those civilizations, because remember, we are in the late Bronze Age. But for now, the Romans had to be resilient and put aside all their doubts and fears. They didn't know what had happened, but they knew one thing: they were no longer where they used to be, and waiting for answers or help from outside without doing anything would be the most stupid thing to do if they wanted to ensure their survival. So if they had to accept that they were going to stay in these new lands for the long term, they had to get to work to start civilization from scratch, practically, they would think. As Philosophai explained to you, Gaul in the 12th century BCE was an extremely rich land, abundant in absolutely every resource the Romans could imagine or would need. That abundance, over the first weeks and months, would be discovered by them, who would not hesitate to take advantage of all those gigantic resources to begin building new infrastructures outside Augustodunum and a new road system to progressively expand towards the most accessible places they would find after several expeditions through those mysterious and unknown lands for them. As crazy as it may seem, during those initial explorations and expansions to obtain the abundant resources of the lands they were now standing on, it is a very high possibility that for several weeks, or even months, the Romans of Augustodunum would not encounter any humans of that time. According to estimates, which are just that, estimates, but it's the best thing we have, the total population within the borders of the future Roman Empire at its peak, during the late Bronze Age, would have been around 7 million inhabitants, that is roughly 10 times less than during the 2nd century CE. And although demographics would not be proportional in each era, if we base ourselves on those numbers, and on the fact that at the time of Trajan, the province of Gaul had a population of around 5 million, then a plausible approximation of how many humans there would have been in Gaul in the year 1150 BCE would be around 500,000 inhabitants. Just imagine the madness of having just 500,000 people living on a land as vast as Gaul. In that context, I think the Romans of Augusta Dunum could easily go weeks or months without encountering another human. But eventually, the Romans would encounter people, more specifically, the most advanced group of people of the time, who had a large presence around eastern Gaul and much of Germania, those being the Urnfield culture. The Urnfield culture were a group of people that were some kind of Proto-Celtic humans that were extremely dominant during the late Bronze Age and early Antiquity around those areas we are talking about, and they're the closest thing to a civilization in Central and Northern Europe at that time. However, don't get me wrong, they were mostly tribal and decentralized communities with settlements as small villages, farms, and hill forts, fortified settlements built on hills with ditches, palisades, or stone walls at best. I mean, look at this. Does that look like an unbreakable fortress to the Romans? Not really, right? And that was the absolute peak of urbanization for the time. The Romans, having expanded greatly from the initial city of Augusta Dunum and having navigated several rivers in the area to explore more distant lands, rivers that, by the way, would look suspiciously like many rivers that they already knew from the world they came from, they would eventually encounter those Urnfield culture people. The first encounters between the Romans of Augusta Dunum and the Urnfield tribes would have been confusing, even disorienting for both sides. The language barrier would have been absolute. The Romans spoke Latin, Greek, maybe some spoke Gallic dialects of the region where the city was before, but nothing like what the Urnfield tribes spoke. Tongues belonging to what we now call the Italo-Celtic branch, primitive, early, and utterly alien to Roman ears. Not a single Roman would have recognized a single word. To them, it would have sounded closer to animalistic shouting than to any known human speech, and to the Urnfielders, Latin would have been just as incomprehensible and too advanced for their understanding. So how could communication even begin? The answer is the same as in all of human history: gestures, trade, and survival needs. The Romans could demonstrate objects, offer gifts, and gradually create a system of signs to communicate basic ideas. And what did they have to offer? Well, from these people's perspective, practically everything. To the Urnfield villagers, Roman goods would have seemed like treasures of the gods. Iron tools, steel weapons, textiles, glass beads, wine, olive oil, amphorae, ceramics, coins. Just think about it. Coins! Precious metal small pieces representing wealth. That would have been insane. All of these were products centuries ahead of anything the tribes possessed. Even the idea of living in a permanent stone house with running water, sanitation, and warm baths would have been unimaginable luxury for people used to smoky huts of mud and wood. The Romans, on the other hand, also needed things. They needed people. 30,000 inhabitants were not nearly enough to secure, farm, and exploit the vast and fertile land that now stretched endlessly around them. They needed farmers, workers, and soldiers, and the Urnfield tribes could provide all of that. So the Romans would quickly realize that assimilation was far more useful in these conditions they were. They could offer these scattered villages what they had never known before: security from raids and famine, living behind stone walls, abundance of food, thanks to Roman plows, oxen, and organized storage, access to trade goods like wine, salt, and metal tools, infrastructure and hygiene, from aqueducts to sewers to public baths. And most of all, a chance to participate in something larger than their tribal life, the beginning of a true civilization. For an Urnfield farmer struggling to survive on primitive fields with weak cattle and wooden tools, the choice would have been clear: either cling to the old ways and risk being crushed, or move into Augusta Dunum, swear loyalty, and gain food, protection, and dignity. And slowly, the Romans would begin to integrate these people. At first, perhaps a single big family moving in for trade, then a small village resettled inside Roman territory. And over the first few years, entire tribes would abandon their smoky huts and relocate to Roman-built settlements, drawn by the promise of stability and wealth, which, with the gigantic size of those almost completely unpopulated lands, it would be extremely easy for the Romans to fulfill all the promises they would make to those people. However, this process was not peaceful everywhere. Some tribes would resist, launching raids against Roman expeditions, but those who resisted would quickly learn that Roman steel shatters bronze, Roman cavalry runs down chariots, and Roman walls never fall to wooden clubs. Defeat would be followed not just by punishment, but by absorption, and the survivors completely exterminated until the last one of these barbarians would be dead. The Romans, sooner rather than later, would realize that in this strange, unknown world, there were no people worthy of comparing themselves to, as far as they had seen until now, all living with technologies and ways of life far inferior and backward to their knowledge, and that therefore they could impose their conditions on anyone without any problem. There would be only two options: give up your primitive tribal culture and language to become Roman, or be exterminated, Mongol style. And frankly, what choice would they really have? Even if the Romans left them alone, when rumors and stories of that gigantic citadel with technologies and art worthy of the gods eventually spread throughout all the Urnfield tribes, it would still be too tempting not to simply go live there and join the Romans, especially if they needed labor to expand their lifestyle, which was objectively superior to anything they had ever seen in their lives. In that context, and having easily won the hearts of the majority of natives living at that time, which, as I said, were very few, it is likely that progressively, the concept or understanding of slaves will lose its profitability, because with so few people to rebuild an entire empire as those Romans of Augusta Dunum would aspire to do, depending on the labor of simple slaves, instead of educated, free, capable citizens loyal to the idea of being Roman, would be much more beneficial to rebuild their civilization in that strange world in which they had landed. After just a few years, I think it's quite realistic, considering the number of new citizens who would arrive at Augusta Dunum, desperate to live among those men with technologies that would seem like witchcraft or divine devices to them, that eventually, at least half of the previously mentioned estimated population of Gaul at that time would have integrated and sworn loyalty to the Romans. Now, with a decently large population, the process of Romanization would begin, teaching them how to speak their languages, read their alphabet, new techniques of agriculture, architecture, working with metals like iron and its objective superiority over bronze, and much more. It would be a very tedious and long process. But Augusta Dunum, being such an intellectual and academic center, would have had the best professors and geniuses in the region during Trajan's time to teach all those inhabitants of the late Bronze Age how to quickly adapt to Roman technologies and lifestyle. During those years of assimilation and rebuilding of their civilization, the Romans would evidently also launch several expeditions all over the place, and little by little, more and more explorers would emphasize from their adventures how extremely strange some of the landscapes, hills, mountains, rivers, and coasts they would observe were, both along the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts. Many would eventually realize that many of the places they explored looked very similar to places they already knew, especially by the time they reached the south and entered the Mediterranean Sea. After all, many natural landscapes would have changed almost nothing in over 1,000 years, and many places that experienced Roman explorers knew would have been recognized by them, such as the Alps or the Pyrenees, very specific and recognizable formations. They wouldn't yet come up with that strange and crazy idea of time travel, but they would begin to theorize that perhaps they had been taken, not to the world of the gods, but perhaps to a distorted, primitive, and savage version of their own world, like a kind of mirror dimension that reflected a more grotesque and rustic version of the world they knew. Under this new hypothesis, which would gain strength and credibility over the years among the elites and intellectuals of Augusta Dunum, they would begin to have more curiosity about exploring the south, even if their territory was mostly centered in the north, having conquered much of what in their world they would have understood as Gaul and Germania. And eventually, they would begin to push deeper into the Mediterranean, little by little, recognizing places in what would one day be their original home, Italy. For example, places like Mount Vesuvius would have been too obvious for the Romans to miss, beginning a long journey of exploration across all those lands that increasingly reflected the world they had once known. But no matter how far they explored, there was still something that confused them and made them feel very alone: the lack of any kind of sign of minimally structured and organized civilization, only crossing paths with extremely primitive and unadvanced barbarians, more animal than human in appearance to them, so much so at times that these people would make the Germans with whom they used to fight seem extremely refined and calm in comparison. But then, finally, after multiple expeditions that had gone further and further, they would begin to reach a place that seemed very familiar to them, the Aegean Sea. And by exploring its shores, they would finally find a semblance of civilization, a decadent one, in ruins, on the verge of extinction, and with a very small population for its cities, but a civilization nonetheless. and many Romans would be shocked to recognize certain places as Greek, just like the city of Athens, or at least what resembled a smaller, more primitive version of Athens, and with its inhabitants speaking a language that, although they didn't understand very well, they could recognize as Greek somehow.
And this is where things get really interesting. For decades, the Romans of Augustodunum believed they were alone in a strange, primitive reflection of their world. They had conquered tribes, absorbed villages, built roads, expanded across Gaul and Germania, but never once had they encountered a civilization that could speak to them on anything close to familiar terms. Until now. Because suddenly, on the shores of what seems like what they'd know as the Aegean Sea, they would have found ruins that look suspiciously familiar. Palaces, columns, walled citadels, and more. And when they finally hear the locals speak, it isn't another strange language closer to animal noises and moans, rather, it is the language of an advanced civilization. It's neither Proto-Celtic nor Proto-Germanic, nor anything they've had to hear from the barbarians they've assimilated in recent years. It would still be something strange, but close enough to something that sounded like a sort of distorted and antiquated Greek. For the first time since their arrival, the Romans realize they are not just in another world of barbarians. Rather, they are standing face to face with the remnants of a civilization. A fallen one, of course, but a civilization nonetheless. And this discovery would raise many questions. How would the Romans react when they would hear this Proto-Greek dialect? Did they try to communicate through poetry, philosophy, trade? Could their knowledge of classical Greek literature let them piece together enough words to understand? Or does this linguistic encounter only confuse them further, confirming that they are in some strange, nightmarish mirror version of their own past? And beyond language, what happens when the Mycenaeans, already battered by famine, war, and collapse, suddenly face 1,000 years superior civilization to them in every aspect, with steel weapons, cavalry that can trample their chariots to dust, aqueducts, and way more? Like, way more. Do they welcome them as gods and saviors? Do they resist them as invaders? Or do they simply crumble, swallowed whole by a Rome stuck in the past? These are the questions that set the stage for the next part. Because, if the Romans have already bent the tribes of Gaul to their will, what happens when they collide with the dying powers of the Bronze Age Mediterranean? Well, that, attractive and well-educated watchers, is where we'll pick up in part 2 of this crazy story on our own channel, Unreal History. So please, after you subscribe and like here, go subscribe there and watch the second part, which will be available at the same time as the premiere of this first part on Emperor Carlos' channel. Thank you again to Emperor Carlos for letting us collaborate with him on this scenario, and we'll see you soon to continue the wild adventure of our time-cast-away Romans at the end of the Bronze Age over on Unreal History.
And thanks to Unreal History for wanting to collaborate with me on this crazy alternate story. The link to his channel and to the part 2 of this story will be in the video description, of course, unless this first part comes out first for members of my channel. I would really appreciate it if you would support his channel and his great work and help him grow just like you helped me grow so much in such a short time. But anyway, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, become a member of the channel in order to have early access to new videos, and comment on what you thought of it. Thank you to our newest member of the channel, Francesco Gaipa. Shout out to you, and I deeply appreciate your support of my work and projects to come. And without anything else to say, see you next time!